To welcome Professor Matthew Gray, Dr. Rob Bray, PSM, and via video conference, Associate Professor Elise Klein, OAM. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses given evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, I'd ask each of you to state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today.
Matthew Gray, Director of the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods.
Rob Bray, Research Fellow, ANU Centre for Social Research Methods.
And Associate Professor Elise Klein at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University.
Wonderful. I'd like to invite each of you to make a short opening statement if you wish, and then I'll be passing to different senators to ask questions.
Do you want to go first, Elise?
Okay, thanks, I will. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you today. I want to acknowledge the unceded lands in which we're all meeting on and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I've been examining broad-based compulsory income management in Australia since 2015, including leading peer-reviewed qualitative research examining the cashless debit card in the East Kimberley. This research was invited by community organisations when the CDC was due to be rolled out in 2016. Drawing on this research and other peer-reviewed studies, I've written about issues of broad-based compulsory income management, including how it makes money management harder, divides communities, depoliticises structural disadvantage, and links in with other punitive policies such as CDP to disempower and disadvantage those structurally unemployed. My research has been published in leading international peer-reviewed journals. It is one of the many studies that continue to provide critical insights into the failures of broad-based compulsory income management. Let me be clear. Research shows that broad-based compulsory income management is a failure. We knew that in 2014, and it hasn't changed since, despite millions of dollars spent by previous governments trying to show otherwise. In the interest of time, I just want to highlight two specific points which I think are relevant given the prior evidence presented in the hearings before this one. First, I support the government's attempt to abolish the CDC in the current bill, but submit that they extend their work to abolish all forms of broad-based compulsory income management, including the Basics card. I can see how a voluntary card that is opt-in at the individual level could work for those wanting to continue with income management. However, this needs to be complemented by accessible, culturally appropriate support services. This new opt-in card may incorporate some of the functionalities of the CDC, but when it comes to the design of this new opt-in card at the individual level, it can neither be the Basics card nor the cashless debit card. This is because these are not just products, technologies, or pieces of plastic. Both have intricate and detailed social lives that surround them. The white card, in-due card, going back to the ration days, intervention, are all common terms linked to these pieces of plastic and signal the broad social and political mess that have developed around these technologies. The CDC and Basics card are also artefacts of failed government logics and policy framings, which puts the emphasis on individual behaviour being the root cause of disadvantage, rather than structural issues such as there just not being enough jobs for everyone, and not everyone who receives social security can have a job. Also, that assumes people receiving social security, alcoholics or have drug problems or cannot manage their finances, and that addiction can be treated through a blunt, punitive instrument rather than holistic professional support and health services. All three logics have been disproven through peer-reviewed research and community best practice. What comes next must break with this approach. It must include a theory of change, framings and engagement that speaks to and supports not only the evidence, but what folks who are using these technologies want. Not to do so would be to overlook foundational principles of good policy design. And second, on what comes next, it must be developed in real collaboration with Aboriginal controlled organisations and traditional owner groups. There must be care for and real regard for sovereignty. There also must be options on the table for programs beyond income management. We must remember that broad-based compulsory income management was never community designed. These ideas came from the Northern Territory Emergency Response and Andrew Forrest's Aboriginal employment and training review. All options need to be on the table with what comes next, including funding Aboriginal controlled organisations and services sustainably, as well as supporting other models that deal with structural disadvantage. Community consultation should not mean the wholesale inclusion of anyone wanting a say at the community level. This is because community deployed in these debates is not without hierarchy and relations of power. Time and care are needed in what comes next, and precedence should be with Aboriginal controlled organisations and those impacted by these tools. Whilst this is all being worked out, all people on compulsory income management, broad-based compulsory income management, should be given the choice to opt out of their current program and can then opt in when the new program is available. And finally, I will say that the level of disdain for people on social security, as we have seen through the CDC and Basics card, needs to stop. Reducing people to understand their realities far better than most, and what is needed needs to be taken seriously, and people should not be infantilised through policy based on racist and classist opinions. If the government is serious about not leaving these people behind, having respect for agency of people at the centre of these debates should be held up as a way forward. Thank you.
Okay. So should I go now? Thank you.
Yes, please proceed. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm making a joint statement with my colleague, Dr. Rob Bray. As introduction, we're both academics from the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods with backgrounds in public policy, the interface between economic, social policy and evaluation. We have both had extensive experience in program evaluation and were part of the team commissioned to prepare input to the independent review of the Australian Public Service, the THODI review on evaluation of the public service. We support the proposal to repeal the cashless debit card. Our basis for this is that the evidence shows that the policy has not been successful. We state this based upon a review of the range of evaluations and studies of the program and our own findings in the evaluation of new income management in the Northern Territory. In doing so, we acknowledge that there are various views about the program, from external commentators and from participants. Our view is, however, that this and other policies need to be judged on the hard evidence about their effectiveness. The Auditor-General's two reports details many of the limitations of the evaluations which were commissioned by the Department of Social Services of the cashless debit card, and that these did not provide an evidentiary base for the program's extension and expansion. We also note that the Auditor-General quotes the conclusion of the separate and yet unreleased cost-benefit analysis that, and I quote, "The core conclusion that the benefits of the CDC are outweighed by the costs appears to be robust." From our experience, we know that evaluations of this type of program are complex and challenging. We can expand further if the committee wishes on our concerns about the evaluations, but we would note specifically the quantitative element of the research was not longitudinal, had no baseline data, and relied upon retrospective behavioural questions. Our published research on new income management shows that this type of question performs very poorly. There was heavy reliance upon qualitative responses, but little attention to the actual interests of those making the comments or attempting to reconcile with the quantitative data. The evaluation largely failed to use independent real measures of outcomes. The only data reported was on crime, where the evidence pointed to no impact or potentially worsening outcomes, but this was brushed aside in the conclusions. This latter is a serious failure, as the fundamental role of these types of programs is to influence outcomes, and this type of data provides solid evidence of outcomes. We note in this regard some other studies have looked at this data with respect to the cashless debit card. In particular, work by Greenacre and colleagues published in 2020 looked at actual gambling revenues, police apprehensions under the Public Intoxication Act, and crime and hospitalisation rates in the Ceduna region and found no impact. It also undertook a detailed analysis of actual sales in a community store. This found that while at that store food sales increased, discretionary or unhealthy food sales increased more than non-discretionary healthy food sales. We further note that this type of data was critical in our evaluation of new income management in the Northern Territory in its own right, and to allow us to test and understand the results of surveys and qualitative data. It is also data we have continued to monitor. This brings me to the two final points we'd like to make in our introduction. Firstly, the failure of justification for this program also extends to other forms of compulsory income management, and we consider that attention needs to be given to these, in particular in the Northern Territory, where compulsory income management, introduced in 1997, for what Minister Brough described as an initial period of 12 months during the stabilisation phase, remains 15 years later, notwithstanding the absence of any evidence of it having a positive impact. Secondly, there is a clear need for these types of initiatives to be evidence-based policy and for rigorous evaluation of policies and programs. As well documented by the Auditor-General and others, the evaluation of the cashless debit card was significantly limited, including by poor commissioning and design. This, we emphasise, is a much larger challenge, but one which needs to be addressed, including committees such as this, in ensuring that evaluation strategies are properly built into and resourced in new and existing programs, and that these results should be made public. In turn, public servants, ministers and others should be routinely expected to provide the evidence that their policies and programs are effective in meeting their goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass to Senator Rice first, and then I have some questions as well.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Associate Professor Klein, Professor Gray here. Professor Klein, I wanted to thank you very much for your evidence today. It was really clear and really succinct as to the problems that we've been facing with compulsory income management. And I wanted to go to your point of there needing to be time and care taken as to what comes next, and that the concerns of getting rid of the cashless debit card and the fact that we've got the basics card still existing in the Northern Territory. And so the difficulties then, however, of unscrambling the egg, given the complexity, the timelines that we're on. I'm just interested in your thoughts of, given that time and care is needed as to what comes next. You said that people should be given the option to opt out of the current program and then opt in when the new program is available after all that time and care has been spent. Just what would you see in broad terms of that timeline and that process looking like?
Thanks very much, Senator. I mean, I think for those on broad-based compulsory income management, the focus should be now in helping communicate them to opt out, what options are available to move off either the basics or the cashless debit card. I'm worried about people being left behind, and what we saw with the rollout in the East Kimberley SAFE for the cashless debit card was just the complete lack of communication and people not knowing what was going on and people being confused and hearing one thing and not the next, and really, getting caught up in this rollout, this poorly rolled out intervention. And so I'd hate to see that again. And so I think, and I think this speaks to a lot of evidence that's already been given to the committee, is that communication and working with Aboriginal controlled organisations, community controlled organisations to help people make sense of what's happening is really important. So given that there's a short period of time, I think that's where the focus needs to be. And then also through developing with what comes next, this voluntary opt-in at the individual level technology, then the same kind of approach needs to happen to help people understand what is available to them. And if it's income management, if it's a voluntary income management that they want to go with, well, fine. But the communication has to be key, and it's not something that we've seen so far.
Thank you. With that sort of working out what comes next and a new tool, which, as you said, can't be either of the basics card or the cashless debit card because of the culture around them. I'm interested to know your thoughts on income management as per the Cape York model, where you've got the communities, the Family Responsibility Commission deciding as part of a other suite of tools and engagement that compulsory income management for particular individuals is appropriate. Whether you've done any research or have any understanding or what evaluation has been done of the value of that type of income management.
I mean, I haven't done research in the Cape, but my understanding of the research that has been done is it's very hard to disentangle the supportive role of the commissioners with the tool of income management. So it's very hard to say, oh, it's compulsory income management that's working there versus the whole holistic support that the program offers people. I'll also say that there's been an extraordinary amount of government goodwill but also support around that particular program over a period of time, and which I think has also helped. I also say that with the cashless debit card, one thing that we did see was early on in Ceduna and East Kimberley was the empowerment of sort of almost like community-controlled committees that worked out if people could have their amounts reduced, amount quarantine reduced. So they were being able to review huge amounts of private information of individuals on the cashless debit card. And it was really a failure. And in the end, people didn't continue to put their submissions forward to try and get their amounts reduced because it wasn't, they didn't know who was looking at their information. They didn't know, there was no accountability looking at what was happening. So, I mean, that's a very, very different model to what you kind of see in the Cape. And so just to say, I'm just making the point that the sort of community, the use of the word community gets used, and I kind of think a bit abused in these debates about who the community is and how these processes work. That's why I'm really pushing for an individual opt-in method because, I think the detail, I think that we've seen with the cashless debit card, the use of community being extremely disempowering for folks that have been on the cashless debit card.
So basically that method, if you were going to have a method like that, it would have to be very much a self-determined methodology that was worked out with the community so that there was trust in who was going to be making those types of decisions.
Yeah, but I think, I think the work in the Cape has been very significant and very specific. And what we saw with the trials of the East Kimberley and Ceduna was nothing like that. And I think it just goes to show how terrible these processes of community control in those committees can go. And I think the evaluations picked up these points also.
Thank you. Professor Bray and
Could I just add on the Cape York? Because Cape York is a very, very specific model and it's so much more than income management. I think the figures last time I looked at was around 10% of cases which actually go to the Family Relationships Commission actually are subject to income management. So it's just one of a large number of tools actually used there. The evaluative material I've seen coming out of it says that it really is difficult to work out the balance of the contribution of the different elements, but the general impression is that the supportive activities, the actual discussions with the Family Relationships Commission are at least as important as any of this very specific actions which flow out of those decisions. So it is a very distinct, a very embedded model, and a lot of the evaluations haven't found a really big impact overall, but to the extent the community believes there is some value in it, I think there's a case for a continuation of some sort of model while this is still supported by the community and the processes do give us some indication of some of the things we should perhaps be learning from. And that's the identification of people who have a specific problem and then trying to work with those people to find out what's the best solution to those problems, how best to help them individually rather than the mass imposition of policies.
Thank you, and certainly the evidence presented to us was that it was a tool that was used pretty much as the last tool in the armoury, to use a horrible, violent analogy, and very much that it was only a small number of people. That there was at any one time about 100 people, and another very significant difference was it was time limited as well. So it was only for a period of a number of months usually that they were on account management. I wanted to go to overall evaluation, and Professor Gray, you talked about the problems of evaluation and the problems with the way that the evaluations were done, which we certainly have heard plenty of evidence of, and we're talking to the ANAO later today as well of their assessment of all of the evaluations. It would have been possible to have evaluated these programs, cashless debit cards, better.
Yes.
If there had been the political will to do so. Given the problems that you were just saying, like in the Cape, of how difficult it is to untangle the measures if you've got a suite of measures going on.
Yes, so I mean, in technical terms, it's quite possible to have done a much more. It would have been quite possible to do much more sophisticated, balanced evaluations, which would have done a much better job of identifying what impacts, negative or positive, or no impact that the cashless debit cards had. In some ways, the evaluation we did in the Northern Territory, which in some ways is more difficult because this was a policy that applied to all areas of the Northern Territory and at the same time as there were many other policies trying to achieve the similar outcomes. Because the cashless debit card was implemented in a smaller number of communities spread across different areas in Australia, it would be easy. It should be even more robust in terms of comparison of the cashless debit card communities to other similar communities. Also collecting proper longitudinal information and making much more effective use of the administrative data, and some of the evaluations that have been done, including the work of Stephanie Schur and Deborah Cobb-Clark around the Northern Territory Emergency Response Income Management, show how you can use existing administrative data, and some of the work done by, I think, Greenacre and colleagues as well is another example of how you can use large-scale administrative data sets to try and look at the impacts of these policies, combined with detailed field work on the ground using different methodologies and from a wide range of stakeholders. And in fact, you can tell, I think, from some of the published reports about that it wasn't working. So even though they were claimed to be showing certain impacts, even those reports alone on their own actually can, if there's sort of a careful examination of the data in those reports, it does show the cashless debit card is not achieving the outcomes claimed. Rob, did you want to?
Yes, look, I'll add 2 points there. The first one is the problem of disentangling. And that can be a really serious problem, and it really depends very much upon the nature of the data that you're looking at and your understanding of the program. So some data collection where you're specifically targeting the people who are participating in the program, you're looking at their outcomes and changes in their specific outcomes over time, and you're also identifying what particular programs are impacting upon them and comparing those with other populations. You can very frequently isolate specific aspects. Similarly, with work such as Greenacre and others and some of our own work in Northern Territory stores allow you to actually directly relate the outcomes to the very specific instruments which are being used. In other cases, it is much more difficult. And for example, in the work I've done in following up from the evaluation on looking at the big outcomes in the Northern Territory, have there been changes in the level of crime? No specific ones. Alcohol, the only changes appeared to be to do with some of the more specific activities in the Northern Territory. Infant mortality has not improved. School attendance has not improved. In fact, it's got worse. And going through all of these broadest social indicators for the Territory really not only says that income management has failed, but so have the whole raft of policies which were actually implemented at the time of the intervention. So in that case, you can't disentangle, but you can say the broad approach there was a failure.
Thank you. I'm interested in your it's almost advice, I suppose, given your expertise in evaluation, as to how you deal with communities who, given the absence of good evaluation, still some people feeling, but there's been a reduction of crime, and the streets are safer and things are better.
I don't want to dismiss individuals in communities' lived experience, but we do know that people's sense or impression may not be representative of the community as a whole, and that's where you need to have external, independent sources of information which enable you to make an assessment about whether that is in fact correct. And also, these policies can sometimes have very varied impacts, heterogeneous impacts. So for some people, and I think Elise talked a little bit about this, they may find that the tool of income management or the cashless debit card style way of restricting expenditure might be a helpful tool for them. For others, it doesn't. And it's about it's important to have other sources of evidence. And of course, you will find, I think, that within communities there's often very varied and often contradictory opinions on something. Rob?
Yes, I'd add a couple of points there. The first one is that in a number of these cases, and I'd emphasise those points already made, in a number of these cases, we actually do have the objective data, which does allow us to make some of the comparisons and determine whether or not those reports are always correct. And that data was, for example, available for the University of Adelaide study. If you go to the data, you discover that they've actually reported that there were an increase in crime levels in the East Kimberley region. I think the Goldfields, there was no significant change, although there was an increase in domestic violence. And to our mind, totally inexplicably, they then said they didn't report the results from Ceduna because it showed no change, which really breaches all protocols for evaluations. A finding that there is no change is as important as a finding that there was an improvement or a finding that there was a failure. With issues such as school attendance, you can actually compare those results with what you actually see. And it's important in all of the evaluations that these things get balanced. Interestingly, the chapter in the University of Adelaide report that talks about alcohol starts off with the heading perceptions of change, but then the language just goes on and starts stating these things as facts. The other really important thing, as well as the fact that different people in the community do have different experiences, is to understand why some of these answers are at times given. And we found that out when we were doing it was told to me while we were doing the evaluation of new income management in the Northern Territory. One of our activities was going out to the communities after we'd done some of the research, talking about the findings and our impressions and their responses to that. And one of the issues that we raised was the fact that the qualitative research or the quantitative research asking people about change in the communities reported that things for children had got much better, that school attendance was reported as having increased. We had the administrative data on school attendance, and that data showed that school attendance had got worse. And I asked the people in the community, can you sort of help me just trying to understand what this information's telling me? And one of the women looked at me and said, well, it's really simple. When we're answering these questions, we're not going to admit that things have got worse for our children. That'd be a shame job if we said that. And besides, what would happen? Would the government come and take our children away again? And so some of these responses are actually shaped by a much broader experience. Some we can explain sort of psychologically, that you report positive things because you're so clever, and you report negative things because of unfortunate things that happen to you, and all of these biases. But we also have to remember the circumstances of people who are actually responding and how they're viewing how we're going to use the data.
Thanks, Dr. Bray, Professor Gray, Professor Klein. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Professor Gray and Dr. Bray first. I'm not sure if you saw, but we had some evidence given to us by the former Mayor of the District Council of Ceduna and the current CEO. They expressed really serious concern about what the impact would be in their community when the CDC was no longer in place. I just would like to give you an opportunity to respond to that, given the research you've undertaken.
I think that the issue of transition is important. So firstly to say is I don't accept that there's evidence that at a community level that the cashless debit card has produced those sort of positive impacts which would then be lost. But the issues of transition are important to take into account. And I think that one of the issues which we identified in the Northern Territory was a tendency for income management to create dependence. You become so rely on, in a sense, in my words, somebody else micromanaging detailed aspects of how you spend your money. And I would expect, and I think the evidence is that cashless debit card can do similar things. This needs to be managed. I note that the Minister, Rishworth, in introducing legislation, stated that Services Australia will conduct individually targeted transitional support interviews those who need it, and that where participants require continued assistance with budgeting, transferring direct debits from the cashless debit card or referrals to further support services, there will be help available, including the option for voluntary income management if they choose. And it's important that this be done and done well. We consider an activity which needs to be monitored and reported on, and also needs to be accompanied by a clear effort to identify service gaps and action to fill these. So in no way do I think we're saying that our support for this particular legislation is saying that there are not issues and there are not needs for services and support. And we would also note, in terms of monitoring, the Australian and Northern Territory government are proposing to work with community organisations to monitor the impact of lifting of some of the alcohol bans in the Northern Territory, using a range of data such as hospital emergency presentations, arrests, child removals and so on. And I think that kind of provides quite a good, the extent to which that's followed through is quite a good model, I think. In the Northern Territory, the issues are more complex because it's been going for a much longer period of time.
Yes, and the one thing I'd add is, once again, his perception of the impact of the card and whether or not that's actually a correct perception. If we go to the University Adelaide report, page 120, it's the point I mentioned earlier. Notably, the present report does not include figures for police outcomes in Ceduna and surrounds because no significant impacts were detected for any offence type. So that's actually reporting on the police data. Now, yes, sometimes, that type of administrative data, there are particular issues. Enforcement may have changed, but then that can be taken into account. And I presume that information was given by the police if there had been changes. But the basic fact is that the data showed there was no change in that area. So it's really important that these perceptions actually get tested against the reality of the impact. Because we really want evidence-based policy.
And Associate Professor Klein, you spoke about the importance of other services to support people in terms of the transition and in the future. What sort of support services would you like to see? And noting that the card was offered in communities accompanied by a range of new services as well. So if you've got a perspective you can give on that existing support and what else you need to see.
Yeah, I mean, the issue about the support services coming alongside the rollout of the cashless debit card in the Kimberley, I think needs a little bit unpacking, because I don't think that funding was distributed in the way that I think people originally thought. And I think there's notes to that effect in some of the evaluations that have been carried out, but the kinds of services that were funded and where that funding actually went I think isn't as straightforward as I think originally claimed. In terms of the support services in the rollout, so do you mean if there was getting rid of all forms of broad-based compulsory income management and the transition from that? Is that what your question is going?
Well, talking specifically about the sites where the bill leads to the abolishment of the CDC, so perhaps putting the Northern Territory to the side for the moment, but in those communities where we'll see the CDC abolished, what support services would you like to see in place to support communities in that transition? And in some of those communities, there were support services attached to the CDC. Some evidence we've been given suggests that it can be quite difficult to tell where you do see positive anecdotal impacts. It can be difficult to tell whether they're coming from income management or they're coming from the services which wrap around income management. So I'm just interested in your perspective on that.
I think the transition needs to be led by traditional owner groups and Aboriginal controlled organisations. So in East Kimberley, I think the role of MG Corp is really significant. And just to note, the amazing work that corporation does in terms of working with families on individual basis to work out ways forward for for their Target 120 program. I'm thinking in particular in the ways in which they work with families to support ways forward is, I think, a really significant approach. And so, there's a lot of really good ideas there. I just think there's lots of different voices that want to get involved in this conversation. I think, making sure that it's led by traditional owner groups, Aboriginal controlled organisations is really essential in mapping out that pathway forward. And, it may take time, and a lot of care is needed by careful policy work is needed to support making sure that the people who are at the target and at the centre of these interventions, are not getting left behind, which they have been for the last six years. That a different approach by the current government is forged.
And you spoke about, in terms of a future product to support voluntary income management, the importance of that not being the CDC or the basics card. Could you just expand on that for me, please?
Yeah, one thing that my research, but others did that looks sort of more qualitative. So, my research was never meant to be an evaluation. It was looking at the sort of social and political life of these technologies, is that they're not just technologies. It's not just a piece of plastic, that they have a whole sort of social life around them. And so, in some of the research that I've done, but others done, these pieces of plastic have a whole sort of program logic that comes with it. Like, it's not just a technology, it's not just a product, that it has meanings in people's lives. And also within the community. So that's why people, call it a white card. The card is grey. But it's a white card because it's an intervention of white people. Now, my thinking, and just, I think it's just, general good public policy is that you really want to, if you want something that's going to work and if you want something that is supported, you really need to get to those root causes of the sort of social and not reproduce the same mistakes that were made previously. So that's why I cannot see how the basics card, but also the cashless debit card. I know people are saying that it's a more superior technology, but it's not just a technology. There's a whole social life around it, and you need to break that. And that's why I'm advocating for, if you're going for a income management, it needs to be individual opt-in, and it needs to be called something else. It needs to look different.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just before I pass to Senator Pratt, can I just confirm for each of you, noting your comments around broad-based income management, but you support the bill as it's drafted?
No, I'd want, I have deep concerns about the 4,000 people being put back onto the basics card. And I think there needs to be some work done around the continuation of the basics card. But abolishing the cashless debit card, definitely supportive.
Without going into the detail, I think the point that we would make is that there is a need for the government to take a clear stance at this point on income management in the Northern Territory. And so in parallel with this process, that even if yet the detail has not yet been worked out, that the government state clearly an intention to remove compulsory income management in the Northern Territory, and to start discussing with communities what alternatives, what options they would like to have, and develop community-driven responses. We recognise the transition process is going to be complex. It's going to be very messy. We warned back at the time of our evaluation of new income management in 2014 that program, rather than creating independence of those individuals put on, was creating dependence. And we've now had people in a dependent state for 15 years. This is not going to be something that's easy to come out of. It is going to be a complex transition. But the appropriate thing in this legislation is not just that one of moving people across, but moving them across in an environment that says it is our intention to remove compulsory income management in the Northern Territory.
So would you welcome this bill as a first step in that process?
Oh, very much so, but very strongly call upon the government to take that next step.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass to Senator Pratt now. Senator Pratt, I think you're on mute, sorry. We don't have your audio, Senator Pratt. No. We still don't have your audio, Senator Pratt, I'm sorry. We'll just give her a minute. Senator Pratt, you might need to contact support services. Just while we're waiting for Louise to get her audio sorted, I know Senator Pratt did have some questions for you, Professor Klein, around how you reached your findings and how you conducted your evidence, and she noted you'd spent some time in the Kimberley, but if you could just expand on how you found your evidence base.
Sure. So it was invited research. So when the cashless debit card was said to be rolled out, community organisations got in touch and asked they were concerned about what was about to happen and wanted sort of an external person to help research the environment and also the rollout of the card. So that included a rigorous ethics process. I was at the University of Melbourne at the time, and over, I think, about 6 separate trips to the Kimberley. Some of them were quite extended periods of time, interviewing people prior to the cashless debit card, so understanding what people knew, and then interviewing, so I think all in all about 50 people who were targeted by compulsory income management, and then also a lot of interviews with who gets called stakeholders of the community around their perceptions and the like, and then a whole lot of observations, participant observations in the community too. So that research has been published by various leading journals, international leading journals, which all have peer-reviewed processes.
Thank you. I'll just check to see if we have Senator Pratt back. No, we still don't have your audio, Senator Pratt. Okay. I think Senator Pratt also indicated me, and I hope, Senator Pratt, I'm not mixing up your question here, but Senator Pratt had a question about the use of evidence by the former government. And I think from her perspective, it had been quite selective in terms of the evidence they'd used to support the continuation of their program, whereas the broad base of evidence seems to not support more broadly, provide an evidence base for the government's stated policy objective. So I hope that's correct, Senator Pratt. So if you could comment on that, please. Perhaps that's one for Professors Gray and Bray.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's from our perspective, I think my perspective, it's very clear that there was highly selective use of evidence and of the way in which the contracting and the commissioning of research was done. I think both, and it's not just my opinion. I think it's pretty clear from some of the ANAO reports and so on.
I'd go a little bit further and say there has been a misuse of the evidence by previous governments, plural.
Yes.
There has been a long history of quite distorted interpretations of what was found, selective quoting of particular reports, and trying to report a detail rather than the overall finding of the evaluations. If we look at the whole history of ministers, there's been very little strong data that supports the continuation of income management, yet we've had a history of ministers quoting particular studies selectively to justify it. And I'd say not just the ministers, their departments. And it's one of those unfortunate things with evaluation and with public policy, and in the work that we did for ANZOG for the Thodey review. The theme of that was actually learning from success and failure. And evaluation has a very important role in identifying success and failure, but unfortunately governments and bureaucracies have great difficulties in accepting failure. Rather than then learning from that, there's a tendency to be defensive and to maintain policies for a very long time in the absence of evidence.
Can I also just add that I think I completely agree with my colleagues' assessments that are correct. I also think what's been troubling is the lack of engagement with all the other peer-reviewed research that's being published around compulsory income management, and there's quite a lot now, and there hasn't been an engagement from sort of the bureaucracy with that research that has been marking out a whole lot of issues around broad-based compulsory income management, and I think that's something that should be addressed going forward.
Excellent. All right, well, I believe that's all the